living longer, living healthier, living better than ever before. Welcome to Mountain Pacific's Healthy Living for Life, a weekly series that gives you the information, education, and expert insight you need to become an active participant in today's ever-changing healthcare climate. Here now is today's program host.
When it comes to fungus, there are many different types and most are not dangerous. Some, though, can be harmful to our health. They can cause minor infections. Some can even be serious. Welcome to Healthy Living for Life, a show dedicated to helping you do just that. I'm Sarah Medley, your host. Stay tuned. We're going to learn how to treat fungal infections. Welcome back to Healthy Living for Life. Joining me today is Dr. Doug Kunzweiler, Mountain Pacific's Chief Medical Officer. Thanks so much for being with us, Dr. Kunzweiler.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
So right out of the gate, let's talk about fungal infections caused by, obviously, fungi. What are fungi?
Fungi are in a kingdom all their own. We have the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, but fungi are a little bit different than both, and so they've been separated out. Most people know them as the molds, mildews, mushrooms, and yeast. So they're familiar to us, but they're different than both animals and plants.
So infections are caused by different organisms. We know that, and we think about bacterium and viruses and now fungi. Can you talk about the categorization of those?
Yeah, scientists tend to categorize organisms according to their resemblance to one another. So bacteria fall into the animal kingdom because they have cells, and their cells resemble in many ways animal cells. Viruses are a very different entity, and most scientists don't consider that they are actually alive. They don't have cells. They simply consist of little bits of either DNA or RNA that are then surrounded by a small amount of protein. And they can't do anything on their own. They rely on entering a host cell and making that host cell reproduce the virus. So they're quite different than other organisms.
So mushrooms are actually fungi. I'm one who loves mushrooms, and some can be very harmless, obviously, but we also know that some are poisonous, and we have to be fearful of gathering them in the woods, for example. So why is that? We've got harmless fungi and really poisonous.
Yeah, so all of the fungi make their living by manufacturing chemicals that dissolve organic matter, and then they absorb it. That's how they survive. Some mushrooms make chemicals that are very dangerous to human beings, and it can be very difficult to tell mushrooms apart. So unless you're an expert or an expert has shown you which ones are safe, it's best to leave them alone.
What other examples besides mushroom are there of fungi?
Well, as I said, yeast, which everybody knows about. Now, yeast can infect our skin, and it can infect our mouths, our GI tracts, but yeast is also used to make bread, beer, wine, soy sauce, so those can be very helpful to us. Most people understand mildew and mold, which can be very destructive to our clothing, to our houses, and so forth. So that's another type of fungus.
When we talk about fungi, we have to talk about spores. What are spores?
Well, that's one of the things that makes fungi unique and defines them. Spores are one of the ways that they reproduce. And a spore is similar to a plant's seeds, but much, much tinier. Some of them are even microscopic. They look like a very fine powder, and they are so small that they will float on the air or float in water. And that's how many fungi spread themselves, is through these spores.
Let's switch a bit and talk about fungal infections. Are certain people more susceptible to getting them than others?
They are. We all encounter fungi in our lives every day, and most of the time our immune system is able to take care of them. But people who have compromised immune systems, people who maybe are on chemotherapy, or perhaps they have a genetic disease such as lupus or rheumatoid arthritis that affects their immune system, they are more susceptible. We know that people with diabetes also, their immune system doesn't function quite normally, and they are more susceptible to fungal infections. Infants are more susceptible.
What can happen with a fungal infection if it isn't treated?
Well, most of the time, as I said, our bodies are able to eventually fight the fungus off and contain it. But if that doesn't happen, they can continue to grow and spread, and sometimes they can even invade tissues and get into the bloodstream, and that can be quite serious and in some cases even fatal.
In previous episodes of Healthy Living for Life, we've talked about antibiotic resistance. Talk to us about fungal resistance.
Well, we have a number of drugs that are used to help control fungus. And just like bacteria, the fungi, if they are exposed over time to these antifungals, they can learn how to counteract them or how to avoid them. And so they can develop resistance, much the same as bacteria are able to develop resistance to antibiotics.
How are fungal infections diagnosed?
It depends on their location. Those that are on the skin, sometimes you can just look at them and you can make the diagnosis by their typical appearance. But oftentimes you need to take a scraping, and a physician will scrape some of the dried material off of that area and then look at it under a microscope, and you're able to make the diagnosis that way. Sometimes if they're bloodborne, you need to draw blood and culture it to find the organism.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kunzweiler. We're going to take a break now, and when we come back, we're going to learn more about fungal infections and maybe even how to prevent them. Stay tuned. Welcome back. We are still talking with Dr. Kunzweiler, and now we're going to discuss different types of fungal infections, particularly nail infections. So talk to us about symptoms of nail infections.
Well, nail infections are fairly common, and the organisms are usually a type of yeast or mold, and they cause the nails to thicken, oftentimes to crack or crumble, and they usually cause discoloration, turning them either a shade of yellow or brown.
How does someone get a nail infection? I remember my children having them when they played sports, as an example.
Yeah, well, we talked about how fungi are spread by spores, and the spores are pretty much everywhere in the environment. If you get a crack in a nail, then the spores can settle there, and particularly if they have some moisture, like you would get in an athletic shoe that somebody's been wearing, then they can grow and attack the nail. And that's how you get it, pretty much, is a crack in the nail and then some moisture.
And how do you get rid of it? I've forgotten all that.
Well, we do have medications that can treat it. In addition to that, though, it's helpful to keep the area as dry as you can. So wearing good footwear that breathes, having clean, dry socks on, sometimes using foot powders to dry the area up. And then if that doesn't control it, there are good medications, many of which are over the counter. Things like Connactin, Lamisil, Lotrimin are available over the counter, and you can ask your pharmacist about that.
Let's talk about another common fungal infection, ringworm. What is ringworm?
Well, unlike it sounds, it's not a worm at all. It is a type of yeast that likes to live on human skin, and it causes a rash that is red, kind of bumpy. Oftentimes the border of it is slightly raised, And then the center of it clears, so it has a very distinctive look.
Where on our body do we typically get ringworm?
Well, you can get it anywhere. It likes moist areas, so areas where you have skin against skin is quite common. So for instance, in the armpit or in the groin, it kind of likes the scalp as well, so it's not uncommon to see it in the scalp, but you can pretty much see it anywhere.
Do the symptoms change depending upon where it is on your body?
Yes. Oftentimes, if it's, say, on an arm or on a trunk, it's just sort of dry and flaky, and it may not have any symptoms at all. In more moist areas, it tends to be more itchy or maybe even painful, and oftentimes it will even cause a little bit of a weepy discharge.
Another type that we hear a lot about are yeast infections. Talk to us about yeast infections.
Well, we all have yeast in our bodies normally in small amounts. We have it in our mouth, we have it in our GI tract, we have it in the vagina, and it usually gets along with the bacteria that are there and it doesn't cause any problems. But sometimes, either because your bacteria have been altered by taking antibiotics or because your own immune system is weak, it can overgrow and then it can cause symptoms.
What's a treatment for a yeast infection?
Typically that requires medication. If it's on the skin, like a diaper rash is often caused by yeast, there are creams and ointments that can be applied that will kill it. If it's in the mouth, for instance, babies often get thrush because their immune systems are not up to par yet, and thrush is an oral form of yeast. There are medicines like nystatin is a common one that will kill the yeast and control it. And there are other medicines that your physician can prescribe or your pharmacist can recommend to you that help to get rid of those.
So you mentioned babies getting infection in the mouth. Who's most at risk for getting yeast infections in the mouth or throat?
Well, people who have badly compromised immune systems. So a real classic one is people with HIV. Their immune systems don't work very well at all, and oftentimes that's how it's discovered that they have that, is through a bad yeast infection of their mouth and their swallowing through the esophagus. Other people who are immunocompromised because they're on chemotherapy for cancer, elderly oftentimes are more susceptible. Diabetics, as I mentioned, are more susceptible.
So when you think about homeopathic treatment for things like yeast and fungal infections, is there anything that someone could do or use over the counter to prevent a yeast infection or even a fungal infection?
Sure. And as we talked about, one of the things that all the fungi require is moisture. So if you have a yeast infection on your skin, you want to try and keep that area dry. Like body powders can be helpful, making sure that you're wearing footwear that breathes, changing your socks, all those things are helpful. So think dry when you think about trying to control a fungal infection. And then there are a number of medications that you can get over the counter, mostly creams and ointments that are quite effective. And if those don't work, then it's time to see your doctor and see about moving on to something more potent.
So we've got about 30 seconds left, and you mentioned practitioners, see your doctor. So when would I know when I need to go see you and get help?
If the things that you're trying over the counter and the other measures that I talked about, if those aren't working, then it's time to go see your provider. Or if it's spreading in spite of whatever you're doing, it's time to go see your provider.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Kunzweiler. And folks, stay with us, because when we come back, we're going to talk about a few more fungal infections and maybe a few tips on how to prevent them. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Dr. Kunzweiler is still with us, and now we're going to switch topics slightly and talk about mold. Dr. Kunzweiler, talk about mold in our home or our offices. I know we're all worried about that.
Yeah, so as we talked about in the other segments, molds are everywhere in the environment. Their spores float through the air. And when they come to an area that has moisture and typically is sort of warm, then that's perfect for them to grow. So they like areas like where plumbing has been leaking. They like shower stalls, especially on the grout in between the tiles. They like damp wood, damp walls. They can grow on paint. They can grow on wallpaper. So you can find them pretty much everywhere in our homes and office buildings.
How does mold affect health?
Well, primarily it affects our respiratory system. So it puts out spores all the time, and we inhale those, and that can cause cough. If you have asthma, it can give you an asthma attack, and it can even set up a kind of a pneumonia if it gets bad enough.
How can you prevent an infection from mold?
Well, the first thing is to try to get it out of the environment. So if you have leaky pipes or you have damp areas in the house, you want to do everything you can to try and get those dried up. If you have areas of mold, and you can usually see it growing, they're usually dark, blotchy looking patches. Cleaning those up, simple dish detergent will work. But I should caution you when you're doing that you should protect yourself by wearing a mask to keep the spores from getting down into your lungs. And there are professional cleaners who also can help you to mitigate mold if you have large areas of it.
Talk about a few general tips that we could give our viewers on how to prevent fungal infections.
Well, as we talked about, fungus of all types, molds, yeasts, mildews, they like moisture. So trying to keep areas dry. Making sure that you have proper footwear, that you change your socks. If you're obese, losing weight can be helpful. If you have diabetes, making sure that you see your provider and get that under control can be helpful. Going barefoot's one way to run into a lot of mold, so I don't recommend that. If you're working out in the garden, wearing gloves is a good idea. If your work demands that you work in dusty areas, wearing a good mask, like an N95 mask to get particulate matter out of your lungs is a good idea. So there are many things that you can do, but in general, think dry and think protection from dust.
You know, you've mentioned the immune system and people who've had cancer and whatnot, but talk more about who those folks are that are really more at risk for fungal infections and other infections like we're discussing.
So as I mentioned, most of the time our immune systems are able to handle fungal infections and they don't become serious. But people who have some major problem with their immune system, and that might be people who have cancer or people who are on chemotherapy for cancer, that always knocks down their immune system. So they are at increased risk. Also, there are some people who genetically have an immune system that doesn't work properly. Diseases like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis can affect that. People who have diabetes don't have as healthy an immune system, so they are at risk. And then sometimes people whose jobs put them in the line of a lot of fungus, like farmers, people that work around grain, storage areas, that kind of thing, are at increased risk.
So would rheumatoid arthritis be a category as well?
It is. We generally just think of that as affecting the joints, but it also does affect the body's immune system, and so that makes them somewhat more susceptible to infection of all kinds, including fungus.
Can you help prevent fungal infections by eating certain foods?
Well, there are people who believe that particularly onions and garlic are helpful in that regard. Certainly won't hurt anything, and it may be helpful. I've read that nuts and avocados are thought to be helpful. I think generally a good healthy diet leads to a good healthy immune system. So One thing we do know, though, is that fungus likes sugar. So if you're diabetic, keep your sugars under control, because that does feed fungal infections.
So we all love our pets. We all love our dogs and our cats. So I hope your answer is no, but can pets give us fungal infections?
They absolutely can. They're mammals just like us, and fungus likes animals. The most common ones are ringworm, of course, and you can get that from dogs. You can get it from horses. Cats usually aren't such a problem, but theoretically you could get it from cats as well.
Darn it. I didn't want that answer, right?
That means you have to go to the doctor and the veterinarian.
Exactly. What type of fungal infections are the very most serious, the worst?
Well, there has been a new form of yeast. It's one of the Candida species. Now, Candida normally lives in our mouth, it lives in our GI tract, it lives in the vagina, it doesn't cause any trouble. But in the last 10 years or so, there has been a new strain of Candida that has developed. And it's seen mostly in hospitals and intensive care units. It's been resistant to many of the usual medications that we use, and it's quite a fatal disease in many people. So that's a new one that's giving us a lot of trouble.
Sounds like one to avoid for sure.
Indeed.
So we are out of time. Thank you so much to our viewers for joining us, and we hope that you'll stay tuned next week for another show. And until then, stay healthy, stay well with Healthy Living for Life. Take care, everyone.
Healthy Living for Life is brought to you by Mountain Pacific Quality Health in partnership with AARP Montana. We'd love to hear from you. If you have suggestions for future programs, visit our website at mpqhf.org or call us at 406-443-4020. You can also catch us on YouTube by visiting our website and clicking on the Healthy Living for Life logo. Production facilities provided by Video Express Productions.